Otherworld 2020. We're kicking things off with Aideen McBride and some spooky stories.
Hello, and welcome to this Otherworld Festival, a very different year. I'm here to tell you some stories, and I suppose to start off, it's easier to tell a story without the mask. You're on the other side of the screen, so it won't matter so much. Some of you have heard me telling stories before. It might have been in your school, and it's great fun to be able to tell stories. And this first one I want to tell you is a nice kind of a ghost story. It's one that was told to me by my father. I'm not from around here. My accent is a little bit different. I come from a little town called Bagnallstown down in County Carlow. And up the road from where we lived, about a quarter of a mile up the road, there was a manor house. There still is a manor house. And in that house lived the landlord that owned the land around, which my family worked for. My grandfather was a herdsman. He looked after the sheep and the cattle. My father worked with the horses. My aunts worked in the house. My grandmother cleaned in the house. She was a kitchen maid. My other aunt was a governess for the children at one time. And there were loads and loads of stories that came from the manor house. Stories of things that happened there and stories of stories that were heard there. And this is one of the stories that were heard. Now, this story happens a long time ago, before there was electricity. No electric lights, no radios, no televisions, no PlayStations, no computer games, no CD players, none of those things. So when the days got dark like they are now, and it was cold and wet outside and your work was finished, people liked to sit back and do something that they enjoyed. Very often they visited each other's houses. Can't do that in these days. But this was before there was any COVID or anything like that. And people would head off, the workers would head out at the end of their day's work and they'd call into a neighbour's house and they'd bring their musical instruments with them and they'd bring their stories with them and they'd set up and there might be singing and dancing and songs and stories told and cards played, all kinds of things like that. And the landlord and his wife and the richer people, they'd head off too to a neighbour's house. And there might be a nice dinner and a dance afterwards and music and singing and card playing. And they'd spend the evening together. That's what people like to do. On this day in the story, at this time in the story, it's an October evening. And the Lord and Lady of the Manor have headed off for dinner in a nearby house. They got all dressed up into the carriage and off they rode down along the avenue and out across the fields. Now, it'd be a while, the next day almost, before they'd get back. And when they were gone, the staff in the house, now they still had their work to do, that was important, but while they were doing their work, they could relax a little bit. And when they were finished, they could sit back and lig a ski. Could make a cup of tea, have a few scones, chat a little bit more, laugh a little bit more, because the lady of the house wasn't there to watch over them. Well, on this day, the kitchen maid and the scullery maid had just finished scrubbing out the kitchen floor. And they'd left the door open in the kitchen and the last of the October sunlight was coming in, drying it up. And they were sitting back with their cup of tea, chatting away, when a knock came to the back door. And there was a young woman there that had worked with them before, but she had left the employee of the house and gone off somewhere else. And she stood there at the door with a suitcase in her hand and she says, "Ladies," they were delighted to see her again. And she says, "I'm heading off to America." She said, "I'm to get the train in the morning down to Cove and get the boat from Cove across to America. Any chance one of you would let me stay with you tonight? Because it's a much quicker journey to the train from here than it would be from my own place across the hills." Of course, they said, come on in, pull up a chair. And they pulled a chair up for her beside them and they poured her out another cup of tea and they put a few scones in on the fire there to cook and they chatted about all the things that they had in common, all the things they knew about each other. And this young woman had worked with them for a while and she was interested in the other people that worked in the house. But in those days, when a young woman got married, she had to give up her work. She couldn't stay working anymore. So there were stories about girls that had been working there that now were married or had moved on to work somewhere else. And she took it all in. And while they were sitting there, in came the old gardener. He'd been out digging a new herb garden in the kitchen gardens. He had dug up a fresh bed and he'd planted in the parsley and the sage and the thyme and the rosemary and all the herbs that would be needed in the kitchen. And he came in to wash his hands and sure, he saw there was a pot of tea made and a few scones there and he sat down too to hear the stories the young girl had to tell and hear all about her plans of heading off to America. And the two footmen, they came in as well, and they sat down beside them, and there was a little party going there. There was, they took some cold meats out of the press, and they made a few sandwiches, and there was a bottle of whiskey found somewhere, and there was a little dram going around, and they were telling stories and telling about people they knew. Now, one of the footmen was a man by the name of Tom Murphy, and he was a great storyteller. And when you got him going, he could tell you stories from now until the morning, and he was full of it. Full of these stories, and sure, when he had a few drinks in him, he was even better going. He got up and out he went into the hall, and there was two swords crossed in the main hall of the manor house, and he took one of the swords down and he came into the kitchen, and he was up on the table telling them stories. Oh, he was saying, out in Coolnishnachta in 1798, there was a great fight, and they were fighting this way, and they were fighting that way, and there was swords flashing around, and they were all going, go on, Tom, tell us more about what happened. He says, oh, and they were fighting this way, and he spun around with the sword. And there was silence. And the tip of the sword had hit off the throat of the young woman and slit her throat, and she'd fallen in a heap on the ground. Well, Tom was pushed into a corner, and the women cleared off the table, and they took the girl's body up and they put it on the table, and then they had to dive for cloths and towels and anything they could get to try and stem the bleeding. But they couldn't stop it, and she died. And they were all in an awful state, and they didn't know what to do, and wondered if maybe they should get the RIC constable or the minister or the doctor or send for the Lord of the Manor. And the old gardener, he stood up and he said, Whisht to all of yous, he said. If anybody finds out what happened here tonight, we all lose our jobs. This girl was going to America. Who's going to know if she doesn't get there? I say we bury her here on the grounds and we say nothing about what happened here tonight. And in the state they were all in, they agreed to this. So the men went out into the herb garden and they pulled up the herbs that had been planted there that day, the sage and the parsley and the thyme, and they left them to one side, and they dug a grave on the herb garden there in the kitchen gardens. And the women took the girl's body and they washed it and prepared it for burial. They took one of the best sheets out of the presses, out of the linen cupboard, and they wrapped her body up in it. They took her rings and her jewellery and they put them into a stone jar that would stay beside her. And then with as much dignity as they could muster, they lifted the girl's body and carried it out to the grave and laid it down into the grave that they had dug. They put the stone jar by the head beside her and they put her suitcase at the foot of the grave. And they said a few prayers over her and covered her over and replanted the herbs, placing a little sage bush up at the head of the grave where she was lying. And then they went in and they scrubbed and they cleaned and they washed and they scrubbed and they cleaned until every trace of what had happened there that night was gone. And they went home. And those that could slept, but there were very few who slept that night. The next morning, the lord and lady of the manor were so full of the news of where they had been the night before and what food had been served and who had been there and what they'd been wearing and all the local gossip that they never noticed this lull, this hush that lay over the staff in the house. And the time went by. Now, Tom Murphy, he couldn't forgive himself for what he had done. And any time he went to talk to someone about it, they went, shh, say nothing about that, it didn't happen. And Tom turned into himself more and more, and he started to drink more and more. And in the end, the lord of the manor had to let him go. Couldn't keep him on working in the house. And as soon as Tom was fired, he got as far away from the town as he could. Down he went to Cove, and he got a job there making wheels for carriages. And the time went by in the house. And about 8 years later, there was only 3 people left working there who had been there the night of that incident. There was the other footman, who was now the butler in the house. There was the scullery maid, who was now a housekeeper, and the old cook was still there. And one October morning, the kitchen maid found herself at the sink in the kitchen, and the window over the sink looked out onto the kitchen gardens, onto that herb bed where all the little herbs were growing and that sage bush at the top of the hill. And she was washing away the plates in the sink, and looking out the window, suddenly she gasped and she let the plates fall from her hand, and there was a clatter, and the cook came out and said, "What's wrong with you?" She had gone so pale. The cook took her and sat her down and said, "What's wrong with you?" She said, "It's him. He's here." And looking out through the window on that little herb bed where the sage bush stood, there was a shadow running the length of the bed, and the shadow was in the shape of a man. The cook said, "That's just your imagination. Now keep quiet. Don't be saying anything or people will hear what you're talking about." She said, No, it's him. I know it's him. He could never get over what he's done, and he's come back now to stand over her. And while this was going on, a knock came to the back door, and a young fella had come racing up from the train station. A telegraph message had come in, and they thought they might like to know up in the big house that old Tom Murphy, that had worked with them so many years before, had been killed that very morning, run over by a coach in Cork. Well, when the two women heard this, they went into hysterics. "It is," they said, "it's him. It's Tom. He's come to stand over the grave of that young woman. Oh, no." No, the butler in the house, he tried to keep the two women quiet, but it was too late. News had gone up the house to the Lord himself that there was something going on downstairs, and he came down to find out what it was. And they soon heard the story about what had happened that night, and how the girl had been killed, and how she'd been buried in the grounds and covered over there up in the herb garden. The lord of the manor sent for the local constable, and together they dug up the grave where they were told it was, and they found the girl's body wrapped in the linen sheet, and they found the stone jar there beside her with all her valuables in it, and the suitcase at the end of the grave. And they took her body out of that grave, and they brought it to the local church and put it into a proper coffin for a decent Christian burial. Now, the grounds of the manor house at home back on to the local graveyard. And in that graveyard, there is a separate section, a private section, that is cordoned off for those of the manor house. And there are buried the Bagnalls and the Newtons and the Veseys. And in a corner of that graveyard, it said, they dug the grave to bury this girl. And it said that if you can make your way through the thorns and the briars of the old graveyard in Dunleckney, if you can find your way to that plot that is cordoned off privately for those of the manor house, and if you can find the spot where that girl was buried, you will see the shadow of a man stand from the head to the foot of that grave, whatever the weather. Now, this story is a little closer to home. In the 1930s, they had the great idea in Ireland to try and collect as much folklore as possible by sending the school children home to ask their mammies and daddies and grannies and granddads and uncles and aunts and whoever else was at home, whatever stories they had, and then to record them, to write them down and send them into the folklore archives. And in the archives, there are thousands and thousands of stories that were collected in the 30s. And among those thousands of stories, there are 23 that came from St. Papan's School here in Ballymun. Now, St. Papan's School, if you remember, was the building that stood beside St. Papan's nursing home now. It was knocked down a couple of years ago. It used to be a boxing club as well, I think, at one time. But that was the building where the school was. And those 23 stories were collected there. This is one of those stories, a little ghosty one for you today. This was Ballymun before the motorway was built. And the road from Ballymun went right up over where the motorway is now and on up towards where the airport is, probably before the airport was even built either. And there was an area there called Ballystruan. Now, if you stood on this side of the motorway and looked straight across, Ballystruan would be the fields on the other side of where the motorway lies. And the girl in this story lived in Ballystruan House. So Ballystruan House was the farmer's house for that area, and that's where she lived. Her name was Kathleen Coughlin. And the story tells us that Kathleen Coughlin was going out. She was doing a line with a carter. Carter was a fella who had a horse and cart, and he could bring things from one place to another. And you'd hire him to bring your cow or your pig or your shopping or whatever it was you needed transported. And Kathleen and this carter were doing a line. They were getting on really well, and they were secretly engaged. Kathleen hadn't told her family about it. And I suppose they were planning all the things they were going to do when they got married. But Kathleen got sick and she died. And none of her family knew that she had been in love with this carter, and the two of them were engaged to be married. Well, Carter was heartbroken and sad enough. But when he took his journey, when he was riding along in his horse and cart, whenever he came to Green Lane, and I'm not sure where Green Lane was, but it was somewhere close enough to here. Whenever he came to Green Lane, he would see the ghost of Kathleen Coughlin, and it scared him. So he started lying down in the cart. Whenever he came to Green Lane, he would lie flat in the cart so that he couldn't see out, but the horses would stop and they wouldn't move an inch further. And when he would sit up, he'd see Kathleen's ghost there in front of him. And when he got home to his own house, whenever he looked out the window, he would see Kathleen's ghost there in front of him. And things were getting pretty bad. He didn't know what he was going to do. And he decided maybe he better go and talk to Kathleen's brothers. So he went up to tell Kathleen's brothers about what was going on. And they says, you're going to have to talk to her. If a ghost is appearing to you like that, you're going to have to go and talk to her. He says, I can't, lads. Oh, he says, I'm terrified. I can't. And said, we'll go with you. He said, we'll go with you. So Kathleen's two brothers went with him, and they didn't have far to go. They'd only walked out of the house and down the road a little bit when the ghost was obviously there in front of them again. Now, the two brothers said they didn't see a thing and they didn't hear a thing, but they saw this young man's mouth moving as if he was talking to somebody. And his mouth moved there for a while, and afterwards they asked him, well, what happened? He says, I can't tell you. I'm not to tell anybody about what happened in that conversation. But he went home to his own house, and the story tells us that 6 months later, he died. But the teller of this story, the girl who collected the story, says it was her aunt went to visit this man in his house a few months before he died, and his house was on Santry Avenue. I mightn't know where the Green Lane is, but I know where Santry Avenue is, and when I'm going down along it, I keep an eye open to see if that ghost of Kathleen Coughlin is still hanging around. This story is right on our doorstep. Just up the road from the Axis here, there's St. Pappin's Nursing Home, an old church that's now a nursing home. And in the grounds of that nursing home, there is a single grave. I'm going to tell you the story behind that grave now. The coola me an scéal sin ó feardar a bhanam Antón McGilla Rua blianta ó hin. Agus dinne sé os goelga do mé, so time con tríl a dhéanamh anish con é a inchint díobh os goelga rísh. Bhí tír na talún san áit an counter seo dar a bhanam Charles Domville. Dar na scéalta an Charles Domville a bhí mar tír na talún timpeall na 18 sa cuaig fear mapa é. Agus rinne sé iireacht ar a má a thuirt an muintir na háite. Thug sé cead don na muintir catalach na háite sé péal a thógáil ar a talún. Ach, dír sé orthú nach meid éon uig timpeall an sépéal. Bhí muintir na háite sástal sin agus thosaigh siad ag tógáil an sépéal. Thosaigh siad timpeall an bliain 18 agus críocna siad timpeall an bliain 18 sin na blianta I ri an gorta mór. Agus bhí siad sásta go leor leanúnt aráig leis an sucrú a bhí déanta le Charles Domville. Gaireadh Charles Domville sean mar a Harlíonn agus fuair sé bás, agus tháinig a bhach ina tír na talún, agus an tanam a bhí ná Charles Domville. Come on. Ach dar na scéalta, ní raibh an Charles Domville sin in éon cur códeas ná mar a bhí a athair. Agus tá scéalta ú fásach grána faoin na rudaí a rinne sé. Dar na scéalta, timpeall an bliain 18 sa cuaig. Bhí sé ag dul I ggur cúpla deoch san Coachman's Inn. Bhí sé I lár an gíomhar, cóngar don 8 bhliain. Bhí sé fuair agus siocfar. Agus bhí a tamánaí feardar a bhanam Joseph nó Séamus ó Ceallaigh ag fannacht dó taobh mu, ag si ar an cóiste lena capal, ag fannacht Charles Domville. Nuair tháinig Charles amach, bhí sé ar meisce, agus sleánig sé ar an talamh ar an sioc a bhí ar an talamh agus hit sé. Thug sé an Milán Séamus ó Ceallaigh, agus tóg sé budgéal isce batha, cás sé an isce batha thar Séamus agus cuir sé trí chinine é. Fuair ó Ceallaigh bás. Agus bhí brón ar daoine agus bhí fear gorthú comán stócha. Well, an lána íag sin dearan an scéal go raibh brón Charles Domville féin, agus cuaig sé go dtí an sépéal, agus dúirt sé go tóraigh sé cead dóibh, just I gcóir an cás sin, I gcóir ó Ceallaigh, tóraigh sé cead dóibh an uag a chuir san I timpeall an sépéal, agus gur íciigh sé as gacrad. Agus seo mar tharla. Rinne siad an uag bra mór ecin tú sa sépéal, agus chuir siad corp ó Ceallaigh I stig san uag. But, sé mí tar éis sin, tháinig Charles Domville ar ais go dtí an sagart, agus dúirt sé, bhí sé sucrathe ag mo iad, nach meid cead a gcuibh éon uig a chuir sa sépéal, ach bris sibh an sucrú sin nóair a chuir sibh nóair a lig sibh domsa ó Ceallaigh a chuir stig san uig. Mar sin, ní beg an talún a gcuibh séar an aisce as seo amach, ach beg ormh 10 punt an bliain a thuirt dom mar cías. Now, I 18 cuaig is anna cuid airgid é 10 punt. Agus sin a bhíle déanamh ag an sagart feróiste. So, má tain sibh suas, cóngar do an Stran Shepel Papa Nefa, an áit in an nursing home an ish. Agus ma ekin tú is jock trud an gata, ekig tú an uig sin. An tain uig awan atá timpel an Shan Forganav, an uig in a will uig calig.